At the extreme end of the spectrum is the kind of doomsday scenario where AI, leads to the extinction of humankind.
Yeah, I think human extinction, that's like really high on the risk spectrum.
That's a pretty apocalyptic range for you to start with. It's just a question of when the sort of traditional approach to graduate recruitment and training is now probably obsolete. I think we could all agree on that.
I'll say juniors are almost looking like they're potentially going to be like de-skilled if we continue on this path.
What is the value add that the human composed law firm provides above and beyond being a funnel for new technological tools?
I think it's a risk to actually bring in AI from day one. They really need to learn the human skills.
Machines instructing machines would be a very weird future.
Yeah, it's just crazy. In this episode, I'm interviewing James Smither, Global Head of Risk Management at Freshfields. We unpack the biggest AI risks to lawyers and law firms and what the future of the legal industry really looks like from where James sits. So, James, AI obviously a massive topic and becoming more embedded into pretty much every business out there. From a risk perspective, what do you think are the types of risks that you're starting to see that didn't necessarily exist before that are keeping people up at night?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and you can really answer that across a full spectrum. So obviously at the extreme end of the spectrum is the kind of doomsday scenario where AI, leads to the extinction of humankind in some way or another. I might park that one because that's probably outside of the scope of legal services risk management teams to manage. But then, sort of dialing back from that, we have a kind of decreasingly small sort of target surface and potential impact area. And I think, it's really interesting to explore the kind of range of risks associated with it. But at the far end, let's say, we can point to all the different kinds of mistakes that I think are becoming increasingly familiar, as you say, Holly, as AI usage is becoming increasingly familiar. So all the trip ups that can happen, the slips and falls, if you like, around AI usage. So hallucinations being the most obvious one. And we're really starting to see that manifest in both solicitors and sort of case law contexts where lawyers are being identified as having provided erroneous citations or inaccurate statements. Then there's all the kind of privacy, confidentiality aspects, which are, again, very complicated, but are increasingly playing out in real time when people are entering information they shouldn't enter into tools they know they shouldn't enter it into, or alternatively, trusting tools that they probably shouldn't trust tools, and tools doing things with information that the tools shouldn't be doing something with as well. So that's a whole area that people are having to be very mindful of. And I think we're going to move into an area as law firms and other companies, including our clients, get more dependent on these kind of solutions as a form of service delivery and indeed service replacement in some areas, particularly in the agentic setting, where we could have a kind of systemic error within a particular platform or software. And that manifests not in the individual examples I've just talked about, where a lawyer or a law firm on behalf of its client otherwise makes a mistake, but a mistake is multiplied across every single user of an AI platform. And that's, I think, where we get into really interesting questions about kind of liability and insurance cover and so on. So yeah, that's a pretty apocalyptic range for you to start with. But yeah, a one-end human extinction, which I think we don't need to go into in too much detail. That's probably the scope of a different podcast from this one. But then definitely the kind of errors in use and then the systemic errors of entire platforms or tools having some kind of fatal flaw, I think are both very interesting. And I think, being realistic, both probably will happen at some point.
Yeah, I think human extinction, that's like really high on the risk, spectrum. But I honestly think your role and risk and compliance roles are going to be so interesting. I think they already are interesting, but I'm slightly biased because I used to work in that field just for a little bit. But I think they're going to become so interesting because as you look at the risks internally, for not only for your firm, but also externally for your clients, it's something that's going to be fascinating, I think, in the future. You're going to have to also, I guess, and I'm looking, at the future here in terms of projections, you're going to have to really maybe even understand AI more than you already do in order to kind of preempt those risks as well for your clients. Do you find that you're having to do that now, or do you foresee that in the future?
I think that's already the case, to be honest. And, if I can go back to Risk 101 a little bit, I think there's a really interesting case study around this topic. And I love AI as an example of a risk to be managed, right? Because there's a bit of a misconception that risk is always downside, and particularly in the compliance area, it often is, right? Breach of regulations or, cybersecurity attack, there's pretty much all downside. But the actual definition of risk that us risk geeks use is the impact of uncertainty on objectives. And AI is the perfect example of how uncertainty can have massive upside as well as massive downside. So all law firms and all of our clients are looking at AI from an upside perspective. And if they're not, they're not doing their jobs properly. It can bring efficiencies. It can power innovation, or be a source of innovation or a tool for innovation. It can absolutely turbocharge things. So there's a massive opportunity piece there, and understanding that is just as important as understanding some of the downsides we looked at in the previous question. But the other thing that's challenging is it's changing all the time. Just as soon as you get familiar with a particular tool or a particular version of a particular tool, a new one comes out, or a substitute or a competitor comes out with different capabilities, with different functions. So it's another area where even the understanding of the tools themselves can't be static, and the risks and opportunities, to use both sides of that ledger I mentioned, has to evolve along, in real time on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis as that understanding goes. We've seen multiple waves within Freshfields where, in 1 week we decide that this particular tool is the best one to use for this particular use case. And then 1 week later, something else comes along that does that same function massively better, like not even a small bit better, but massively better. So we're not in an area even where you can kind of rely on people to have a static understanding of the opportunity and risk equation and sort of factor that into their work. People have to be constantly adapting and evolving, and that's exhausting. It's exciting. I think it's both at the same time, but it really underlines what you said at the start, which is the role for risk and compliance and all of this is going to increase, not decrease. And that's before we start talking about the next great leap forward, which is sort of artificial machine intelligence or quantum computing, and what that means for both the opportunity equation and for the risk equation as well. And firms again like Freshfields are already thinking in those terms, that when that next Rubicon is crossed, what does that mean for risk then? And therefore, what do we have to do now to prepare for quantum computing, for example? The basic premises, I'm sure there being that encryption stops working as the main defense against in protection of confidentiality, encryption being the key tactic that everyone uses right now to keep data safe in transit and in storage. And if that can be broken at the speed of light by quantum computers, what do we do then? And how safe is information now that could be harvested now and stored for future exploitation by quantum computers? So it starts bending your mind pretty quickly when you start living in this digital era we're living in now.
Each week, I take what I'm hearing in conversations with legal leaders. I analyse the market and track emerging trends in this AI era. In my newsletter called The Future Lawyer, Market Intel for the AI Era, I'm focused on what AI is exposing, the opportunities, the blind spots, and the shifts shaping the next 5 years. This is how you see the chessboard before everyone else does. As you say, the risk and opportunities just completely expand dramatically from what I can see anyway, and I'm sure you see a lot more. It's just crazy. But I guess when we initially spoke, one part of our conversation was about, well, this is fascinating for you, somebody who's, years of experience within your position, and AI can massively help you do your job. And also you can understand the risks and opportunities of AI for businesses and for you as a firm as well, because of your experience. But the graduates is something that, concerns me as well, because obviously juniors and graduates, they're the future of the legal profession. They're the future managers. They're the future of your position, for example, as well. And I think you mentioned that the traditional kind of graduate program is probably not going to be as relevant in the future, and it's designed for a pre-AI world. How do you see that evolving in this new kind of era?
Again, great question, and thanks for sort of pointing me in the talent direction. It's not an area I mentioned in my previous two answers, but you're absolutely right. The kind of talent equation changes just as much as the sort of technology and privacy and confidentiality equation. And it's interesting. You can see it in a couple of ways. There's sort of, we're going to have the first generations entering the workforce who are kind of AI native and have grown up with this toolkit at their disposal from a young age, rather than dinosaurs like myself who've had to kind of, learn it later in life and adapt our previous skill sets and knowledge to it. And that brings challenge and opportunity, right? There's an interesting concept that people who are native to AI usage will have much different views of how to use it, how to deploy it within the work. And there'll be a real role, I think, for kind of legal technologist hybrids in the law firm of the future. You can imagine use cases that, frankly, someone like me will struggle to come up with more entrenched analog ways of working, if we can put it that way. But at the same time, there are fundamentals of the kind of education that you or I would have had, Holly, and anyone above that AI native generation who's learned how to read a document from start to finish, synthesize it, summarize it, make, or absorb information from multiple documents and produce a summary, or produce executive summary, bullet points, take a note of a meeting, all these basic skills that junior lawyers have learned since the year dot, really, that AI native generation will never have had to do that. They'll always have been able to rely on tools to do that. So in the absence of that skill set, will they have the ability to question the tools that are doing that for them and to spot mistakes that are being made in the execution of those tasks by those machines? So there's a really interesting disconnect there between the instinctive use of AI and the skepticism of not having grown up with AI and what that means. And then, of course, it's no secret that the shape of the workforce will shift as repeatable, low-level, should we say, operational tasks can increasingly be performed by machines. The staff who previously performed those will be pointed in different directions and asked to do different types of work. Does that leave a smaller core of staff who then are future managers who understand the nature of those tasks and then can supervise and allocate work on that basis if they've never done that work themselves? That has an interesting question for who are the partners and administrative leaders of the law firms of the future, and indeed our clients of the future as well. So, and as I mentioned, things are changing all the time. So what we assume will be possible for a human versus a machine worker today will be very different in 3 or 5 or 7 years' time. So how do you even do workforce planning in that context? What is the right investment to make in skills learning and development, graduate recruitment, graduate programs, internships, apprenticeships now, without knowing exactly what capabilities are going to look like in 3 to 5 years' time? So the simple answer is there is no easy answer. And I think all employers, not just legal services employers, are having to accept that things are going to be in transit for a while, right? And I agree with your premise in the question that the sort of traditional approach to graduate recruitment and training is now probably obsolete. I think we could all agree on that. But in terms of what the new solution looks like, it's going to have to be a kind of suck it and see approach, and it's going to have to evolve as the tools evolve, and it's going to have to be about agility and almost being led by what the new capabilities are at any moment in time, rather than trying to write something that will be future proof for the next 5 years. So I think that's just a fool's errand if that's something that anyone's trying to do. But I'm really interested in the whole skills equation, and you're seeing studies starting to come out from universities now about cognitive decline and new generations lacking certain skills, even while they're, as I mentioned, particularly proficient in others. And that has a different equation as well for how we staff and supervise and manage our businesses in the future as well. It's not to say one generation is inferior or superior to the other, but understanding that people will learn differently and process information differently as a result of the extent to which they use or don't use these tools is going to be very important for staffing, for organizational structure, but also for risk and compliance as well, and who's checking who's doing what and who's spotting mistakes.
I definitely agree with everything that you said. And yeah, I do think that we're going through a time of where people are, or I'll say juniors are it's almost looking like they're potentially going to be like de-skilled if we continue on this path, because AI is doing a lot of the work, and so many law firms particularly are bringing in so many tools that are just helping. I think if it was me, I would probably start training juniors on human skills more, and not even introduce AI at all, because I think it's a risk. We're talking about risk and compliance. I think it's a risk to actually bring in AI from day one for them to use, because they really, really need to learn the human skills, number one, but also learn their role where technology is not involved. How that works in practice, I don't know. Whether that would even work, I don't know. But I think it's so important, these types of skills.
And I think what you're getting at there is getting quite quickly into kind of existential questions that all service provider companies, not just law firms, are looking at now, which is what is the value add that the human composed law firm provides above and beyond being a funnel for new technological tools that are in the market that we can use, but also that our clients can use directly themselves. And you're absolutely right. What will differentiate the winners and the losers in the new equation is the value add of the humans in the loop as well as the machines, because you can ultimately assume some very good machines will emerge and there'll be a consensus around which are the best ones, and increasingly everyone will use the same one. So what does distinguish us from our competitors will be the human value add and the additional insight, reliability, trust, insight that is provided above and beyond the mechanistic, repetitive efficiencies that those machines are driving. So I think you're right that to the extent that it's possible to build those skills in the humans that you're hiring at the bottom of your talent pyramid to be your leaders of the future, that makes sense. I think, again, it's interesting though, because previously legal employers, again, like any other employer, have been able to rely on the education, certainly secondary in schools and tertiary institutions, universities, polytechnics, whatever it is, professional training courses and technical qualifications to give their employees a certain amount of grounding in some of these skills. And then as those institutions themselves change, and as more and more work is done through AI, and we already see this in terms of people, processing exams, but certainly coursework and research through AI, that assumption that you'll get people who already have a certain amount of skill and you don't have to do much beyond polish and finish that off as the employer will also have to change, and employers will be looking more building those skills from scratch than they did previously, which is a different training equation from the current calculation. So you're right, different numbers of people coming in being expected to do different things, but with a different needs profile in terms of the skills they need to be taught and developed in. And that's, again, changing to such an extent that it's very hard to say what a program will even look like in 2 years' time, let alone 5 years' time, when the people who are currently 15 or 16 in these new education systems we're talking about are entering the workforce. So, yeah, I don't envy my colleagues in HR on that basis, but at the same time, it's a conversation we all need to be having, because these have long-term implications for society as well, right? Not just for individual organizations. And I think that's what perhaps is less appreciated, is the extent to which this is transforming cognition and relationships and the economy more widely, rather than just the balance sheets of individual companies that are quicker or slower to adopt these technologies.
You're right. Things are changing so fast. And to go back to what you said before, it's actually really hard to design some type of trainee program or whatever, because who knows if a new tool might even come out in 3 months' time, which could change the game completely. So it's like you kind of have to play it by ear a little bit and just go kind of step by step and just see, take the approach based on what the market's kind of telling you and what people are telling you, which is so tricky. And like you say, I really don't envy the HR people, because that's just really complicated. And I don't envy graduates either. I do feel for them. This is a really hard time, I think.
No, I agree. I mean, it's sugarcoating things not to say it's a challenging time to be contemplating entering the job market or entering the job market. And I think your point about HR teams is right. We had actually a fantastic AI academy here at Freshfields a few months ago, and I think what it did really well, it didn't do things very well. What it did really well was just encourage people to be curious and agile. It didn't say this is the way to do it and this is the tool to use. It said these are some of the use cases that we all have, whether you're a competition lawyer or a finance employee in our business services team. These are the use cases we have. These are all the different tools we have. Play around with them, try different problems, try different use cases, try different products, and keep doing that and keep being curious. And I think that's the mindset we all have to have, that you, as I say, you can't get complacent and think I've cracked this, or I've got my solution to this particular use case, because something else will come along in a month or a year or a decade's time that completely turns everything on its head again. So we all have to be agile, and that's a harder skill set to learn for us oldies, I suspect, is that, if we've always used PowerPoint or we've used Excel, then we probably have been stuck in our ways to a certain extent. And that's what's changing now, is that the use case can change every week, or at least the solution to the use case can change every week. And that's where I suspect our younger colleagues will teach us, because what I'm amazed by is the way they're already using it in every aspect of their lives, right? Not just the professional aspect of their lives, but everything from, coaching to diet to social plans, and that's the kind of mindset we need to take into the workplace, with appropriate safeguards, risk and compliance guardrails as well.
Yeah, no, definitely.
You'd expect me to say that at the end, of course.
Yeah, you had to put that in there.
Yes, not just a free one, of course.
Yes. Yeah, I remember I saw a poll that was done on LinkedIn, and it was basically asking juniors and graduates, if you were offered a position in a law firm and you were deciding whether to take it or not, and they didn't have AI training, or they didn't have like an AI focused culture, or what's the word? Like an AI thought process, if you know what I mean. Would you still go and work for them? And the majority of people, I think it was like a massive portion of people, said that they wouldn't work for a firm if the firm wasn't kind of pro AI and actively training people on AI, which I guess is kind of obvious. But I'd love to get your perspectives. And I know you've mentioned a few points there, but from a risk perspective, what do you think about training staff generally on AI? I know you said, it's good to be curious, it's good to test things, and perhaps from a risk perspective, it's good to allow people to experiment, because otherwise, if you don't, then they might start doing it themselves anyway, and then you can't control how that turns out, and it might, breach compliance regulations potentially. So yeah, I'd love to get your perspectives on that, apart from the things that you've mentioned about curiosity and experimentation, what you think about generally training staff on AI.
Your question has given much of the answer I would look to give there, but I do think it's interesting. I kind of perhaps naively assume that everyone would be more or less moving at the same pace here and that we'd all be experimenting at the same time. But I'm actually surprised when I talk to some peers in the industry how slowly some legal services organizations are moving. So I know there are still law firms out there that have essentially switched off a lot of these tools for most users and said, no AI in client-facing work, for example, or no AI at all on firm devices, and that shows a much wider spectrum than perhaps I expected. I kind of thought we'd all be in the same place, which is this is here, and we have to move with the times, and we have to use it. So the conservatism is there, and I'll be interested to see if that translates into your reference to that poll into them struggling to get some of the talent that's anxious and keen to use the most cutting-edge technology. I suspect that line won't hold for very long, but we'll see. But then in the firms that are kind of in, use mode and experiment mode and, optimize mode, I think training is absolutely critical, because I think you're right. If we don't make these tools available in a safe kind of sandbox type of environment where we know that the data is held on premises and that, use cases for client facing work are safely contained, there is always the risk, of course, that people will try and achieve these efficiencies anyway. And instead of using their firm device, they'll pull out their personal device and try and achieve the same efficiency result. It's an industry driven by deadlines, by time, by pressure, by often trying to do multiple things at once and achieve as much efficiency as possible. So human nature suggests people will always try and find, if not shortcuts, then at least efficiencies to do that. So that's why I think the smart law firms are recognizing that this stuff is here. People are using it in every other aspect of their lives. It's reasonable that they should expect to use it in their professional lives. It's also reasonable that our clients should expect us to be using this in our work because they're using it in their work, whether they're financial services companies or whether they're, natural resources companies or companies in other sectors, they will be using AI. So why would we not be? So if that's your starting premise, that these tools are here, they're available, they're increasingly good, they're not perfect, but every year they get better, and every year the use cases get more convincing, why would we not be supporting our people to use them in a safe sandbox type environment? And I think that's where training comes in, just constantly reminding people that while these tools are exciting and some of the results they can produce look spectacular, you still have to retain an element of skepticism. They still make mistakes in the same way that humans always made mistakes before we had these tools, and the same rules need to apply. That supervision needs to happen. A senior person needs to be checking a junior person's work. We can't take anything we see coming out of these machines at face value and assume it's 100% accurate and so on. So that's where the training and the safeguards, the controls come in. And I think most sensible people recognize that's the way to go. Use this stuff, embrace it, inject it into our processes, make it part of everyday life, but retain the same skepticism we would if we were reviewing a brand new starter's work who hadn't been here very long and didn't know the way things work or hadn't done a project of this type before. We would be checking their work very carefully, and we need to have the same mindset where we're checking the work that these machines produce.
I don't know if you saw that case, that case against OpenAI. I laugh because it's slightly ridiculous. And I think it was like an insurance company is suing OpenAI. I think it's like $10 million for basically a woman sued them and she used AI as the lawyer. She fired the lawyer and then basically sent all this documentation to the insurance company, and it was all wrong, incorrect stuff. So the insurance company is suing OpenAI because they basically spent hours going through all this documentation. It was incorrect and not wrong cases and these things. And it's like, we all knew that we can't rely on, on ChatGPT and AI. Well, not now, not at this point anyway. I mean, apart from, I don't know about legal tech like Legora and Harvey. I don't know, but probably we can rely on it. I've never used it, but ChatGPT for sure. And people get a bit surprised when they get the wrong, incorrect answers from AI.
Yeah, I mean, people shouldn't be, right? Because we've all used it in our personal lives and seen it make mistakes there. I mean, I used the example, I wanted to go and see a movie on a Friday. I had off from work and I asked it to give me some central London cinema listings. I confidently walked up to the cinema expecting to see the film I wanted to see on at the time that AI told me it would be on, and it absolutely wasn't. So there was a hallucination right there. And if you can get something that feels that basic, that's just based off, reading the cinema's website and playing it back to me when the cinema times are, then you can bet your bottom dollar it's going to get more complicated stuff involving synthesizing lots and lots of case law and providing a recommended course of action on a litigation matter, for example, wrong. So that skepticism needs to be there, and anyone who doesn't recognize the potential for mistakes, frankly, at this stage hasn't been following the story. But to go back to your original point, I think there is an interesting challenge here for our industry, that it is democratizing access to legal expertise, that you can take any tool, including the most basic and open source ones, and say, do I have a case to sue this person or this company or this counterparty? And not only would you be told, yes, potentially you do by that tool, it will then offer to draft you, the letter and the claim, and you can send it at almost zero cost, whereas previously there was, of course, barriers to entry to doing that, like having to instruct a solicitor and having a conversation with them about whether you really did have a case and whether the case had merit, and how much it might cost and how long it might take for you to get to a point of issuing your claim. And now that's all happening at the speed of light with really no downside for the individual claimant. So all this kind of plaintiff via AI action is going to be a reality for years to come, and that's why I suspect there'll be efforts by the industry or other sectors that are likely to be recipients of these kind of claims more often than not to do something about that, because that potentially, as you say, the sort of admin cost of having to fend that stuff off or take it on face merits and deal with it is going to become unbearable, and it won't be machines doing all of that. Again, there's probably a machine answer to that machine question in some cases, but there has to be a human element in all of that as well, and that can become unmanageable pretty quickly. So it's another kind of unintended consequence of this new capability, is this sort of potential explosion in sort of amateur litigation, if I can put it that way. And that, these kind of things need to be considered. And some of those cases will have merit, of course, but a lot of it will involve a lot of effort to not much benefit for anyone there.
And the funny thing is, would somebody go to, I don't know, somebody who's studying law in law school and use them as their lawyer and then sue the company because it's like, oh, they gave me the wrong advice? Probably not. So why are people thinking that AI is 100% accurate as their own lawyer? It doesn't make any sense, really.
Well, you asked that, Holly, but people do the same with Google and medical conditions, right? People really ask a computer, whether I have this particular health condition or what, why is my head hurting today? And people do that with Google all the time and come to the most horrendous conclusions about what it is they may be suffering from. So I think that's human nature. If there's a kind of lazy or easy or less intimidating route to get an answer that you perhaps wanted to hear to start with, then it's human nature to try and get that answer. So yes, and we all know there's a sort of people pleaser element to AI. We've all seen it in the models that we've used. It is anxious to go above and beyond. So it doesn't just give you an answer that you're looking for. It then potentially provides you with the next step and the next action, and has already drafted that for you. And all you need to do is press send. And in the world of agents, it might even issue that for you without you even having to, to send it yourself. So the potential for things to get out of control, or at least to take several steps forward before someone's really thought about whether this is a good idea or not, just is multiplied with the agents. And that's another really interesting angle for law firms, both as kind of service providers, but also as solution providers, is where does agentic AI take us and what new risks are around that model? And I think that's a very hot topic in the industry right now. We could have a whole other podcast about that one, I suspect.
I just want to go back to the training point, because I actually did a poll on LinkedIn. I'm getting a bit obsessed with LinkedIn polls now because loads of people seem to respond, and I'm like, oh, this is really interesting information. So I keep asking people random questions. But I asked people, lawyers, how they prefer to learn about AI within their law firms or in-house teams, whatever. And I think it was like approximately 42% said they want formal training, and around 33% said they prefer peer-to-peer training. So let's say somebody's tested a tool through it, like experimenting, and then they show their results and what they've done and their process and their thinking and all these things, and then share it with their team. And then the rest of the people said they prefer to hear it through like podcasts. And I thought it was really interesting that there was almost a similar statistic in terms of formal training and then peer-to-peer learning. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
The results of your poll are really illuminating, and I think it's interesting. I already alluded to the training we had at Freshfields. It was exactly a mixture of the first two options you gave. So there was definitely some theory, what is the use case? What are the main tools that are available to do this? What is the sort of science of what's happening here and what we can expect, the limitations and the benefits of this approach? But then immediately went into use cases, and that was led by our peers. So I personally found that really enjoyable, and I think that's absolutely critical when you're trying to persuade people to use this stuff. I think for the kind of AI natives I've talked about earlier, who are already using this stuff as they breathe and as they eat and as they, brush their teeth in the mornings, that's less important for them. They'll be interested by a new use case or a prompt that can be shared that's worked really well for someone else, but they're kind of already plugged in. It's sort of dinosaurs like me who need to be taken by the hand and said, you've always done this task. Let's just open this tool up and work together for the next 10 minutes to try and get an answer and see if that answer would look dramatically different from how you might have done this a week or a month or a year ago. And that was incredibly powerful, I think. And that's what gets people who are skeptics or fearful or just set in their ways into this sort of world, is actually sort of getting everyone together and just get the laptop out, open this tool, and let's just do this use case together. Let's do a due diligence use case together, or let's do a content generation use case together. And it's incredibly powerful. So I think that I'd be interested to know the demographics of your respondents. I suspect the more confident users are the ones who said they would love to learn it via podcast or just a short piece of information on a new use case. And I suspect the people who answered, peer group learning and demos by kind of product champions or people who have just been on the road slightly longer will be people like me who are kind of still bending ourselves into this world and forcing ourselves to be adopters and champions, because that was my experience. That's the sort of different demographics we're dealing with. But it always demonstrates why training has to be hybrid, right? Different people learn in different ways. Some people are kinetic learners. Some people are sort of passive learners. Some people are active learners. And we have to not just cater to different learning types. We have to keep reinforcing, because as I mentioned, and as we've agreed multiple times already in this conversation, this changes all the time. So just rolling out training on January the 1st and saying, job done, everyone knows AI now, that's doomed to failure as well, because by June the 30th, the landscape's changed, and you have to keep messaging, you have to keep going out through different channels and using those different training toolkits to get the message reinforced and updated, because this landscape is shifting all the time, which is what makes it so exciting.
Yeah, it does. It's such an interesting point there, what you say about kind of generational type learning. I mean, I wouldn't dream of learning about AI through a podcast. No way. I need to actually see something. I guess you could see it if it was, a video podcast, but still, I'm not going to sit down and really, learn from that.
If you've never fired up Copilot before, right, then I don't think a podcast is going to make you do that unless you're already in there. So I think someone who sits with you and goes, this is where it is on your device, and this is how you enter a prompt, and this is how you follow up, and this is how you save things. That's much more useful for the nervous users. And I think that's why I think sensible learning programs will recognize the sort of different user journeys that we're trying to cater to here. But yeah, it's interesting that some people just need these ones need to have a plug put into their head and an update uploaded in, and carry it working just with the new knowledge sort of layered in on top, whereas other of us need to build that up slightly from the base upwards, shall we say.
It's interesting. I might go back and have a little look at who answered what and just see if it is a generational thing. Yeah, it's a really, really interesting way. But like you say, people learn differently, especially with AI. It's important to teach people differently, I think. Just kind of moving on from that point, I know many firms are looking at AI as having a competitive edge, and that could be allowing new talent to be attracted by AI training that they offer, or it could be using AI in their day-to-day work, which makes people more efficient, or it could be, I don't know, offering it to clients. There's different ways that law firms can be more competitive by leveraging AI. Do you think it's changing the way that law firms actually are competing in the market?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting one. I think there's a lot of distinction that needs to be made between the signal and the noise, right? Because of course it's a competitive industry, so there's going to be a lot of noise, and everyone's going to be trumpeting. Yeah, they've got a new technology, or they've got a new chief technology officer, or they've got a new partnership with a big name startup or unicorn in this world, and they've got a new relationship with the university, or they've got some kind of scholarship. So a lot of it is destined for that audience of clients, or for potential talent recruitment and market competitive positioning. So distinguishing between that noise and the actual signal of what's changing. As I mentioned, I'm surprised that the pace of change is slow in some organizations actually, and they're still very conservative about who they're allowing to use what. And that probably reflects different client bases levels of conservatism. I think, law firms that have tech clients would be much more advanced than law firms that perhaps have much more heavily regulated banks and insurance companies as clients, as one example there, although I don't think that holds true in all cases. But the mode of travel is definitely towards more adoption. Of course it is. It has to be, especially as people realize that efficiency is the inevitable outcome of greater usage, as long as you manage the downsides we talked about at the beginning. Of course, that goes without saying, I hope. But I think, what's also interesting is that eventually convergence will happen. Some tools will emerge as leading. You've already alluded to some kind of very popular legally flavored tools that are being used by large numbers of law firms. So that eventually won't confer a massive competitive advantage if everyone's using it in the same way that everyone uses similar document management systems or similar client untaken due diligence platforms at the moment. Those don't confer competitive advantages. So they just become a sort of bedrock of BAU efficiency as well. So there will be a distinction between what emerges, the kind of consensus tools that everyone ends up using, and you're just stupid if you're not using them, because why would you not? It makes you more efficient. And then what's genuine competitive advantage? I think genuine competitive advantage is much rarer. And I think, the vast majority of press releases you see aren't really about competitive advantage. They're just about doing something quicker than other people that eventually everyone else will do as well. And that's where the value will come in, is where someone comes up with a truly unique use case. And I suspect those will not be in mainstream activities that will be automated by large platforms ultimately, and clients will ultimately be able to do that work themselves if they want to. It will be in more niche areas of patent law, let's say, for example, or competition law or HR law, where someone comes up with a genuinely innovative use case that works in that particularly unique area. And that's where I think, you'll see a provider or a law firm be able to carve out a niche for itself as being the go-to provider. That's my prediction. I could easily be wrong, but I think that the learnings from other technology adoption within the sector is, there was one firm that was dreaming the first to switch on to fax machines, and then another one that was the first to switch on to email, and so on, and then eventually everyone uses it. So I think in large chunks of the sort of technology estate we're talking about, it would just be who's the early adopter will get a bit of a financial advantage for a while they understand the efficiencies, and then everyone else will copy them. It's the niche use cases where we'll see genuine, exciting innovation and sort of differentiation on that basis.
It's a really interesting point, actually. And I think it could well be that firms can create their own kind of competitive advantage internally using AI by creating their own processes. And like you say, if they all use the same kind of legal tech, then they'll all be using the same way of working. But if they do things a little bit differently and maybe create their own ecosystems and different cultures that really thrive off using AI, I think there could be a massive potential within firms if they're just really, clever about the way that they are able to leverage it and maybe train and create this culture. And I think really it comes down to culture, honestly.
It does. And that comes back to our talent conversation, right? I mean, this is why I suggest, and I think you agree, that the answer won't be eventually to stop hiring young people completely and just have machines do all the repeatable tasks. Because of course, it's not just about repeatable tasks and operational efficiency. The young people coming in will be the ones who have the ideas of, well, you've always done it this way, but why don't we try doing it that way? Or there's a completely different way to think about this. And here's a use case for a tool that you're not using as a law firm, but I've seen in a different context, and you can apply it in this area, as I said, of patent law or copyright law or HR law or whatever it is. And that's where innovation will come. So you'll still need the people to have the ideas of how to use things differently. Otherwise, we're just all using the same things in the same way. And a differentiator into parts becoming BAE, as I've said. So I think that's really interesting. And that's why I suggest the sort of the talent equation of the future isn't just who's coming out of university with the best law degree, but who's coming out with the best kind of combined legal and technological expertise. Those are the unicorns that law firms will be trying to hire. Possibly more emphasis on the latter than the former, right? Because a lot of the legal knowledge of yesterday is less relevant in AI age than the technology insights of tomorrow.
Wow, it's so interesting, like just thinking about the future but also comparing it with the past,
Yeah, and there are questions we haven't even got onto, Holly, like what does this all mean for billing? I mean, it's less my area, but the traditional model of pricing for the legal industry since time immemorial is chunks of human time, right? And at what point does that become less tenable when the majority of work done on an instruction is done by machines rather than humans that operate in 6-minute or 15-minute chunks. And I'm not being black and white about this. There's already a vast nuance in the world of pricing. It's not my area. As I said, there's a lot of contingent pricing, success-based pricing, fixed fee pricing, and so on. But at what point does the chargeable hour completely disappear or only get applied to partners in a billing model when more and more work is being done by these machines that every law firm has, or the clients could have themselves, and they're just asking the humans to provide value on top of that? That's going to be really interesting to watch as well, because it's a bit like democracy. It's the least bad system, and the death of the billable hour has been forecast by smarter people than me for a lot longer than I've been in the legal services industry, which is only kind of 6 years. But I do have a sense that this is slightly different to other sort of step changes that have previously been thought of as being potentially the end of the billable hour model. I think this one really could be, but let's see. We'll find out pretty soon.
We now have an actual tangible thing that will help us be more efficient. Whereas before it was all kind of like, oh, we'll move to value-based things. It makes more sense, which it does. But now it's like, okay, we've actually got something that will make things so much quicker. And now the billable hour kind of doesn't really make a lot of sense. And we actually have something that is showing us that, now.
Yes, exactly. Like you say, it's tangible. So how do we justify our value and price and commodify our value in that context where a machine can do a large amount of what was previously charged? It's very interesting.
What would your advice be to the future lawyer in this AI era?
I mean, first of all, I would hesitate to give too much advice to young lawyers, having never been a lawyer myself. So I would say don't listen to too much about what I say. But I mean, from a general, old person to young people entering the job market, I guess, and hopefully applicable to lawyers as much as anything else, I think, this is happening. The change has happened. This is now part of the professional equation. It is now, it is either embedded or will soon be embedded in pretty much every area of white collar work, if we can call it that. So this is the reality, in the same way that it will be embedded increasingly into academia and school. This is how work happens. So there's no hiding from that. There's no denying it. So embrace it, because embracing it is the only alternative. And then be curious and be agile, because I don't think it's the end of work. I don't think it's the end of young people work. I don't think it's the end of old people work. I think everyone has different contributions to be able to make, but it has to be around that central tenet that this is a core part of how we work. So the curiosity, the willingness to work with it rather than see it as the enemy or the thing that's been sent to substitute you is the only approach to have. I don't think that's a particularly revolutionary viewpoint, but that's the reality of the future world. This is now part of the equation. How do we work around it, and what value can we add and derive and, supplement to it with our own unique skills that remain, in the same way that people in certain professions will never be replaced, tree surgeons, and others, what makes us a tree surgeon in our setting, whether that's a law firm or a professional services firm or a bank, that means we have to be retained alongside this technology.
It's a very positive point.
I hope so. I genuinely think there's no interest for anyone in a kind of completely, mechanized society. I mean, our clients don't want to be obsolete in the same way they don't want us to be obsolete. Machines instructing machines would be a very weird future, right? So it would still require human interaction. It's just, what does that interaction look like in 10 years' time? It's going to be very different from what the client to lawyer relationship looks like now. But I think it will still have purpose, meaning, and value.